The Remos that Michael learned to fly in is a brand new category of general aviation aircraft meant to provide today's students pilots with modern training airplanes and to simplify the process of learning to fly. The light sport aircraft movement is just one recent development in general aviation meant to improve the future. And while you and I may ponder the future of general aviation from time to time, there is at least one pilot who spends a great deal of time thinking about the future. John Petersen is the founder of the Arlington Institute, a futurist research institute in Berkeley Springs, West Virginia. Considered by many to be the most informed futurist in the world, he also happens to be a general aviation pilot and an aircraft owner. An award-winning author, Petersen was recently hired by NASA to present a vision of aviation in the future. For us today, he will share the results of that work as it pertains to general aviation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome futurist, author, and AOPA member, John Petersen. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Tom.
Break a leg.
Thanks, Tom. It's great to be here today. We've got about 30 minutes here, and what I'd like to do is walk you through a process where a professional futurist, how one would think about what the future of general aviation would be. And when you get in my business, one of the first things you learn is that it's a system. You can't look at aviation just by itself. What you have to do is look at aviation in the context, in the larger context is what is here. And I've got some slides here. We'll get some slides up and we can look at those. The best place to start in terms of all of this is to get some slides. There we go. And so what we have to do is understand the context. This is a big system, and we'll start at about 30,000 feet and kind of look down at all the pieces of this. And for me, you look at the future by starting at the past. And one way to look at this is through a process that evolutionary biologists have identified that says, how has change happened in the past? And they call it punctuated equilibrium. And it starts about 33.5 million years ago. The first single cellular life showed up on this planet. And about 1 million years ago, multiple cellular life. And then vertebrates came at about half a billion years ago. And then mammals were about 50 million years ago. And the interesting thing about this is that when this relationship settles down, each succeeding era is about 1/10 of the one that preceded it. So it's spiraling, and they're getting shorter and shorter. So mammals showed up about 50 million years ago, and then the first early humans at about 5 million years ago. Homo sapiens at about 130,000 years. We moved from hunter-gatherers into agriculture about 10,000 years ago. We moved into cities and towns and got the first written language about 5,000 years ago. And then the movable type. Gutenberg invented movable type just 500 years ago. And you see, again, this relationship that when it settles down, it's 5,000 years, 500 years. How long would the next one be? 50 years. How long would the next one be? It would be 5 years. And the thing that's interesting about these transitions, these punctuations to new levels, is each time you go through one of those transitions, is that there's about 8 or 9 times the technological advantage. There's the explosion of information about 8 or 9 times. And the transitions get shorter and shorter. And so you can look down this kind of a relationship, and you can see that it's exponential change, that it's going faster and faster and faster. It's not linear change, which most of us are familiar with, which is the red line on this chart, where you get a given amount of change no matter every year, no matter how much input you put in. But it's exponential. It's like this projection in this chart of the rate of change of population. It lays flat for a long time, and then suddenly it screams for the sky. And you get amazing kind of change in very short periods of time. And I would argue to you and with you that we are at one of those punctuation points, one of those extraordinary kind of transitions into a new period of time where we're going to get amazing kind of change in a short period. So let me talk you through about a couple of ideas that kind of represent that and then take it into what it means for general aviation. First of all, if you're interested in these kinds of things, Ray Kurzweil, a futurist friend of mine, has written a book called The Singularity is Near. And what he did is he looked at all of the kind of canonical kind of paradigm shifts that have happened in the past. The evolutionary of human intelligence, planetary science, you've got the structure of the universe, you've got the history of life, you've got all kinds of things by molecular evolution, and all of these independent assessments of how life has changed in the past. And what he's done is that when you take all of these individual assessments, and they're all down the right-hand side of this chart here, and you normalize them and put them on the same chart, what it runs is from billions of years ago than when these things happened, and billions of years to the next event, down to 10 years. That's 100 years, that's 10 years down at the bottom. And so what it says is these big shifts are happening faster and faster and faster, and they're getting into a period of time where their transition is just a matter of a handful of years. And that's what we're living in right now. Kurzweil says if you follow that projection, you get in the 21st century, you're going to get 1,000 times greater technological change than the whole last century. Now, nobody in this room understands what that means, because in the last century, in 1903, the Wright brothers flew their first airplane, and we got automobiles, and we got the internet, and we went to the moon, and if you multiply that times 1,000 times, you cannot wrap your head around that. And if you parse it down, though, and say what would happen in the next 10 years, though, if those trends continue, what you find is that there's 70 or 80 times the change of the whole last century that show up in the next 10 years. And you could be off by an order of magnitude. You could be 7 or 8 times the whole last century. In any case, it's extraordinary. And what it means is that there has to be fundamental change across the spectrum of almost everything we know in terms of technology and how social values change and other kind of things in order to support this kind of change. And so let me give you a variety of kind of data points and trends that point to this. For NASA, I did this piece of work that Tom talked about. They wanted to look out to 2050, 2040 to 2050. And if you look out just to 2030, these kinds of rates of change, there's 150 times the technological change of the last century that are going to show up then. So, I mean, we're surrounded by an amazing amount of change. So the number one thing that comes out of this is that it's going to be an all-electric world. So if you look out 10 years, it's going to be quite clear that by 20 years from now or so on, it's going to mostly be an all-electric world. And you see that in aviation in very interesting places. In my business, you look for early indicators and weak signals. And the early indicators and weak signals could be in model airplane business. Here's a model airplane, and my friends in that business say about 50% of the model airplanes now are electric motors rather than gas engines. And, of course, that translates directly into the Unique, which is an electric airplane that you're going to be able to buy and you're going to be able to fly next year. But it's also happening other kinds of places. The 172 Cessna that we're all familiar with already. George By and the Cessna folks are working on an electric airplane, an electric 172 version, which they hope they're going to fly for the first time next year. And then you've got these, again, early indicators of where things are going. Here's the Solar Impulse, which is this airplane, which is a solar airplane, and it's getting ready to fly around the world nonstop, just based upon electricity. And there's all kinds of plans that are out. Here's an airplane that's a design that's on the works, and then they got sexy little ones like this that are pretty cute that are in the drawing boards. And where it's all going, and what's the kind of defining the issue here is about batteries. Batteries are the kind of the dirty little secret about all electrical things, because that is the constraint in the whole system. And what's happening is there's huge kind of changes that are happening in batteries. There's been a doubling of energy density in the last 10 years in the development of batteries. And in just the last 6 months, there have been all of these kind of comments that have been made. Here's a 50% more capacity, and this one has got, replace the existing lithium battery cells This one is 50% decrease in cost and 200 to 300% more power. And you can see these comments. But anyway, there's all kinds of research being driven primarily, by the way, by electric cars. The automobile industry is what's driving this. And you can start to see that in spades as it starts to move itself into the aviation business. And then the real deal breaker, if you will, is this e-store. And this is a new type of technology. And you can't see this slide very well, but essentially you can charge a car battery in 5 minutes, and it'll go 500 miles with that kind of a charge. And the weight of it is 300 pounds instead of 3,000 pounds for lead-acid batteries, which we have now. And so we're clearly on the way. You can see the trends coming in terms of battery technology that are going to be able to be put back into airplanes that'll start to allow you to do things. When I was at NASA, the advanced design group from Boeing were there, and they already had a conceptual model, a whole kind of engineered conceptual model for a hybrid electric airliner that was really quite a beautiful airplane. Already there are fuel cell airplanes that are in Germany. They've just had another announcement last week about that. So you're going to get an electric world and electric airplanes. What's happening at the same time is amazing computational expansion and explosion. Kurzweil says that by 2045, the non-biological intelligence, that's like computer intelligence, created in 45, will be 1 billion times more powerful than all human intelligence today. Again, you can't wrap your head around that. You don't know what that means. Kurzweil says that they become so powerful, the computers, that they all work together and they tie together, and we start working for them because they run everything. I mean, that's the singularity in the title of his book. The singularity is near. So anyway, you're into this space for which we have no analog. We have no precedent. We don't have any tools to be able to understand this. And I'm not suggesting at all that it's all going to show up into GA in the next 10 years, but you're going to start to see it. It'll be clear that it's starting to merge into the space. And the thing that's going to change it most is artificial general intelligence. Artificial general intelligence is computer programs that start to act like human beings. They're smart. They make sense. They look. They talk to other people. They research. They look around, and they're not just a set of things like when you call up United Airlines and want to make a reservation, and this disembodied voice asks you, do you want this, do you want this? That's artificial intelligence, but that's an expert system, and it only knows one thing to do, how to do. But artificial general intelligence, what you have is capabilities that'll do anything. You just tell it what it wants to do, and it goes out and it looks around. Now, lamentably, what always happens when you start talking about artificial general intelligence, the conversation degenerates and people start saying, you know, what's the machine going to do with love and sex and things? And let me tell you, this is a classy presentation, and I'm not going to go into that space and talk about it. But I will tell you a couple of examples of where this is going. By the way, Love Machine is a really neat website that has nothing to do with sex, by the way. But DARPA is already doing things like this urban challenge with this car that's got a sensor system, and they only had like 5 minutes in a memory stick to plug in the coordinates of where the car needed to go to, and all by itself, autonomously, it sensed the environment, made the decisions of where it wanted to go, and got its way through the middle of town, Manhattan, or wherever the thing was going. I don't remember offhand. You have the same kind of things happening in very practical terms. On my iPod, on my iPhone, I've got Siri. Siri is an application where I can. Yesterday, I just raised it up, and I said, "Tell me the next flight from Dulles to LAX on United." And in 5 seconds, it gave me the list of the next flights. And it knew that Dulles was an airport. It knew LAX was an airport. It knew United was an airline. And it started to make those intelligent kind of decisions and understanding. Those things are all coming together, and they're coming together in a suite of onboard kind of capabilities in airplanes like you've never seen before. And one of the things that underpins it is the next-gen kind of capabilities, the ADS-B kind of things, because ADS-B has 2 data links. And so that there's in addition to the basic kind of data that they're going to be able to put up and transmit back and forth to the airplane, there's a variety of other kind of things in time that you probably can move back and forth to the airplane. So if you think about that, there's amazing kind of things that you can do. Already, for instance, I've got on my phone this application, Plane Finder AR, that stands for Augmented Reality, and you can listen here, just hear an airplane, you can't even see it, and point the phone up into the sky. It takes down the data link from the ADS-B, and it tells you, maps on a map, where the plane is. You can look up, and it says at 329, here's a United Airlines at about 35,000 feet, and here's how fast it's going, and so on. So you get a sense that there's a huge amount of information out there, and if you can capture that information and start to bring it into the environment of the cockpit, it starts to change everything. Now, the way technology evolves is through synthesis. It's through integration. And in the same way that an iPhone takes all of these individual capabilities that otherwise would exist alone and starts to integrate them together and trade off of the kind of the strengths and the underlying capabilities, that's starting to happen in spades across lots of other places, and it's going straight toward airplanes. Augmented reality is essentially saying, tell me everything that's available about a given situation. Here's a building in London. Here's a picture on an iPhone. And what it's gone out into is multiple databases. And what it's reached out and said, what do I know? What's available to know about this building? Down in the lower right-hand corner, it says there's a taxi stand right there. There's a little horn up at the top, and it says that there's music, live music in this bar up here in the evening. It says that you can pick up a newspaper at this place, and you can eat down in here. And what it does is start to overlay in front of your face what you can see, what's all of everything that's available. Now that is already making its way into automobiles. In-car navigation systems start to do this integration of all of these capabilities, the device and the windshield view and the voice-over directions and in-car navigation and the GPS and such. And what you're on your way to is something like this. Here's a Hitachi kind of concept model of an intelligent head-up windshield. And you can see that the Starbucks is right across the street. You can tell because it's coming by. And here's your speed. And here's a woman, and it has her description. And I don't know whether she's in the back of that car or not, or what it is. But here's your GPS up here. But it starts to give you all of this information on a real-time kind of basis. Well, you're already starting to see that in the cockpit now with synthetic vision and other kinds of displays that are indicated right out here in the hall. This starts to move into new space when you start in the ways that you interface with this technology. Because already now, Ford is starting to, in ways we've never seen before, initiate a verbal interface with your car. So this is more than just asking it to dial the phone and make a phone call for you. It starts to be the way that you largely kind of communicate with a lot of the systems in the car. And those things, once they get established in a car, are going to start to move themselves into aviation. And so someday when the GPS that you've got in the car and the GPS lady who's telling you directions and which way to go, and when you move that in with augmented reality into a cockpit, you're going to have a virtual co-pilot that essentially knows everything, has sensory information, takes it all in, integrates it, and probably can fly the airplane better than you can. But clearly you're moving into those kinds of spaces, it seems to me. And it's not just talking to the thing where it's going. You're starting to be able to take thought control. It's not just voice control and audio control. It's thought control. And there are already games and games that have gestures that use no kind of and verbal interaction. And so you've got a variety of commercial now ways in which you can start to take your thoughts and convert them into space. And so it's not far-fetched to think that 10 years from now, maybe you go into the goo and you flop down the visor and shoot, you see the whole world in just reality and like as though there's no clouds at all in front of you. Or maybe it's more like this with a little kind of visor in front of you that You can't see, but it's being reflected on there and projected, and so she can see through that and see what things are. But in any case, you're moving into this layered kind of environment that's going to really change. Now, what you also get is an internet revolution going along. This is unlike anything anyone's ever seen before. You have multiple functions: social networking, search, audio, and visual communications and visualizations. And they show up in a capability, in an integrated capability that dramatically increases the effectiveness and the connectivity of the underlying system. Essentially, a global brain is emerging. Dan Redding, writing about the future of the internet, says if you combine all these things together, the web of things with Second Lifestyle, 3D, and so on, what you can imagine is a web-based duplicate world. A web-based duplicate world. And if any of you saw Avatar and you saw the movie, did you sit there and be in amazement at the reality that was produced by this artificial, all computer-generated kind of things that you just couldn't tell the difference between that and reality? And that's the direction we're going, because we're going into a space where ultimately you might be able to sit down and just surround yourself with some other place that has the fidelity and the and the resolution that just makes it seem like it's almost there. And so what you set up is this very interesting thing relative to aviation, and that is that aviation is designed to take your physical body from one place to another place. And there's a tension about that, because what's happening in terms of the internet is that virtual travel is going to allow you to move places. So let's say you want to go to Las Vegas, right? You want to go play the slots in Las Vegas. But right now, the only way to get to Las Vegas is to climb on an airplane, unless you live close by and you want to drive. But if you climb on an airplane and go there. But there's a place out here in this future that's coming along, not very far into the horizon, where in fact you can start to give you an immersive environment that starts to look like the slots and feel like the slots and maybe smell like the smoke and stuff. I don't know. But it starts to replicate this personal, interpersonal kind of relation, interchange that we all have around us in the way we work. Then the decision starts to be, shall I take the airplane or shall I go otherwise? And so in terms of not only GA but also commercial aviation, what you've got is an interesting kind of play between the internet and between aviation as we understand it. What you're also getting is big contextual change. I won't tell you a whole lot about this, but if you look at the future of GA, you've got to think about these kinds of things. The possibility of climate change. What it now looks like is that the climate is being driven primarily by the sun. The sun is going into a period of quiescence and quietness that probably will turn into rapid cooling in the next couple of years. And so, my, oh my, if that all happens, then that would change everything. You got social shifts coming along. Here's this guy, Aubrey de Grey, who's an acquaintance of mine from Cambridge. And Aubrey de Grey is working on life extension. And Aubrey de Grey says that an individual who's 60 years old today will probably have the potential to live to 200 years old because of the advancements in biotechnology and other technology that's coming along. I mean, think about that. I mean, there's some hope for some of us, right? I mean, there is some good news in that. But I mean, it's an amazing kind of thing if you suddenly start to extend lifetimes in ways that you haven't before. And it's not all just theoretical. I mean, here a couple of years ago, the scientists went off and they took the genetic code from a human and they took the same thing that was in a mouse. They manipulated the code in the mouse, and they get this genetically engineered super mouse that stuns scientists. It runs nonstop for 5 hours. It lives longer. It has more sex, and it doesn't get fat. I mean, how's that? And tell me that DARPA or some secret government agency isn't trying to make Marines that do this kind of stuff. I mean, you're into a new space where it's changing on all many different dimensions. The financial disruption, we're not out of the woods yet there. I mean, there's still a whole lot of kind of commercial loans that are 2.5 times the size of the subprime mortgages that are still going to be problems. And then you have a fundamental energy shifts that are all happening, and we all know about that. We've talked about that in AOPA and other kinds of places. Here's the classic kind of peak oil kind of curve, but that's not the issue. The issue is that the oil's getting harder and harder and more expensive to find. And so we're running off of this cliff where early on for $1 spent, you got $1 worth of energy. And now we're up to $1 gets you only $3 worth of energy. And if you go after tar sands and oil shale and hydrogen is down here, it costs you $1 for $1's worth. And that's why we're being driven into spaces for alternative fossil fuels, like in engines like the Delta Hawk, which starts to use a diesel engine that'll use jet fuel and kerosene and other kinds of things. You're also going to be huge kind of breakthroughs that are coming together at the same time. There's a whole breakthrough in terms of energy called zero-point energy. What the quantum physicists will tell you is that there's in a cubic centimeter, in a sugar cube in front of your face, there's more energy than all the known matter in the universe. And so what you've got is an amazing amount of electromagnetic energy, kind of from DC to infinity, and it's surrounding you everywhere, and scientists are starting to figure out how to capture that and turn it into either electricity or into heat. They've already measured it 2 years ago. It was the big story in Nature magazine, and already this company Storn out of Ireland has a product which they're commercializing and making available now, which they say produces more output energy than you put into it. Now, it takes energy from the larger system, obviously, from the open system, but what we are is on the verge of a huge kind of breakthrough in kind of capabilities that could fundamentally change the way we fly and the way airplanes fly. And let me tell you, if you look across that spectrum and you work your way out there and you think about the options, that there's a distinct possibility in the next 10 years you could have a breakthrough in things like anti-gravity, to where aerodynamic forces and the way that we've needed them in the past might not work the same way, and so maybe you start to get into different kind of aircraft shapes. But in any case, it drives you then finally to the question about why airplanes in 2020. And there's kind of a set of things. What do we know about that, and why do we use airplanes? Well, in 2020, if the present trends continue, airplanes are going to be more intelligent, if not brilliant, at that time. They're going to be easier to fly. They're going to be cheaper to fly. They're going to use less fossil fuels, and they'll cost less to own. And people, on the average, if, again, some of these trends continue, are going to be older. And so they're going to have things that they want to do. And they will value experiences more than acquisitions. Now, let me tell you what that means, is that there's this shift in terms of the values in the United States and around the world, away from acquiring things to having experiences and personal development. And that could have very interesting implications for aviation, because the Internet's going to change how we interact with the world and travel, and then what happens is there's going to get more vehicles, and they're going to get more vehicles like the Terrafugia, a copy of which is sitting over there on the other side of the room. And this is the second generation ideas they have of an automobile that flies. And you're certainly going to get, again, the synthesis and the integration of these different kind of capabilities coming together. And who knows, maybe in this attempt to try to have experiences, this is an early indicator. This guy who straps these rockets on the back of him and flies around. And so there's a variety of kind of ways in which this might work its way out. I hope in 10 years there's some of us that are still flying two-wing airplanes and flying upside down and doing some of the things that I like to do. But I can assure you, in any case, it's going to really be quite a different world. By the way, if you're interested in these kinds of things, I have a free newsletter that we give away on the web, and you can get on the website and you can download it, and every 2 weeks we can send it to you. But I can assure you that this is going to be an extraordinary, interesting kind of time that's going to be the beginning of a fundamental shift in the way GA works. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, John. That is fascinating stuff, and you're right. It is hard to get your head around some of the things about what's happening, both short-term and particularly long-term. You mentioned sort of early indicators and things that we should be looking at that begin to portray what might happen in the future. And for a lot of us who think a little bit more short-term than you do, we're concerned about what's happening with general aviation and the way things are going. We look at what's happening in Europe and the fact that fuel is so hard to get and there's so many regulations and it's so expensive and all those sort of things. And a lot of U.S. pilots worry that the European experience represents what general aviation may become even in this country. What do you think about that? Where are we going?
The United States is an extraordinary anomaly in the world, in the kind of, not only the general freedoms that we have to fly, but the ability that we have to do things like build airplanes like the Lancer that I've got. And what we have to do is protect that, because the experimental, the home-built area represents kind of the leading edge where you can test new technologies and new concepts and new engines without them having to be certified. And that, in general, is an extraordinary kind of advantage that we have here in this country. And I, for one, am a little concerned about the way the government seems to be constraining across the board lots of things that we took for granted in the past. And I would say that one of the things that we have to do is make sure that we keep all of this open. I know AOPA plays and EAA play on the forefront of this kind of stuff. But we need to keep those kinds of capabilities open, because if we lose them, we lose an amazing kind of future where these new ideas can be generated.
How do we get people interested in aviation? Is there a concern that the general aviation almost becomes irrelevant in the future?
Well, I don't think so, because again, I think that there's this interest in experience. And there's a tension here, and there's a lot of concern at AOPA and other places about the inability to get more pilots into the system and the dropout rate in terms of the training kind of process. And I would just suggest that I think that one of the issues is that we have to make airplanes easier to fly. Because you've got a generation of kids, you've got a generation of young people, for instance, who are wired differently. Their brains literally operate a different way. They parallel process in 7 different levels. They have an extraordinary ability to do this metabolism that's faster. We all know about this, and they never read the instructions, right? They open the package and then they go and
are guilty of that. But.
And they do it. And they need instant gratification. Right. They learn fast and they want things to happen in a hurry. And right now, you can't do that in aviation. It takes a committed kind of period of time, and more than that, it's counterintuitive. It doesn't work like anything else does. A friend of mine at dinner the other night was telling me the first time she tried to taxi down a runway, she was going all over the place because she had to steer with her feet, and she never had learned how to steer with her feet, and she was holding onto the yoke, and the instructor was banging on her hand and telling her, don't do that. Well, I had an interesting conversation with Bert Rutan about 10 or 12 years ago, and he was saying it's all available to make the process of flying an airplane far more intuitive, more car-like, or so on. And what I think is, in order to keep the attention and bring people into the business, it's got to somehow start to get easier. The 3 things I was interested in as a kid was fishing and ham radio and aviation, and all 3 of them are going down, and the reason they're all decreasing is because it takes time in order to learn.
Yeah. And one way that we've seen pretty dramatic changes in the way that people learn is through online learning, internet connections, and that sort of thing. And some of the technology you talk about from a communication standpoint sounds pretty phenomenal in the future. But what impact do you think the communications channels that we're seeing emerging today will have on how it is that people learn to fly in the future? And is that any kind of an assistance to what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think so. I think what you're putting in place is the ability to do computer-enhanced and augmented kind of, to augment the piloting process. And clearly, as the software and the computer applications become smarter, as I suggested, that you've got the ability to present and make far more intuitive the process of flying. And so I think that we're on the path to doing that, and that ought to be one of the, I would argue that associations like AOPA, that there's a proactive kind of role that they could play in terms of staking out some of these things on the horizon about how it needs to look and how it needs to work, and encourage across the board manufacturers and others to try to get to this new space.
How about individual pilots? A lot of them out here today and watching on the internet. What is it that individual pilots can do to help grow the pilot population and get more pilots?
Well, I don't know, cut a hole in the fence around the airport or something like that. It's a real problem to try to get kids and young people onto an airport these days, and that's really sad, and I really I'm not very happy about that kind of trend. And so I guess, Young Eagles and some of the things that AOPA and EAA and others do is helpful, but I think what you've also got to do is do more than just give kids a ride. I think you have to bring them into the process. You have to show them how, and it needs to be more than a one-time kind of experience. And somehow the kind of almost the spiritual nature of flying needs to start to get communicated and see it as far more than just the mechanical processes that they got to get through.
John, thanks so much for sharing your wisdom with us and your insights about the future. It's exciting to think about. We appreciate you joining us here on AOPA Live.
Nice to be here, Tom. Thanks.